Welcome to the record. I'm Mark Maxwell. The Missouri Senate just moments ago adopted a bill to ban transgender transition procedures for all minors in the Show Me State, those 18 and under. That proposal threatens to strip doctors of their license or perhaps open them up to lawsuits if they engage in treating teens with those hormone therapy medications, puberty blockers, or surgical procedures. Republican State Senator Holly Thompson Rader wrote portions of these proposals, which now head to the House, and Senator Thompson Rader is now on the record. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. And my bill is actually the Save Women's Sports Act. So I was the co-sponsor of the SAFE Act, which is the transgender preventing children under 18 from being having the procedures. The bill that I sponsored and ushered through was the Save Women's Sports Act, which was only allowing you to play in the sport of your biological birth.
And I appreciate you raising that. We'll get to both of those. I saw you were a co-sponsor on both pieces of legislation, including
Yes.
the SAFE Act, which the acronym there is the Save Adolescents from Experimentation Act. Experiment?
Right.
Wouldn't an experiment be something where we don't know the outcome?
It would. And you know, we had several previous transgender people come and testify, and that had in their adolescent years and their preteen years and teenage years had felt as though they were of the other sex, got surgeries and were also on the hormones, and then later decided that that wasn't how they felt. And but the damage was already done, and so the opportunity for them to transition back was certainly not as easy.
Yeah, the American Medical Association and some of the medical groups that publish studies on this, they will say that puberty blockers, often the word irreversible or permanent comes up in this debate, and puberty blockers are reversible. Those are not permanent. But once you go beyond that step in the treatment process, you do start to wade into the waters where there's a level of permanence in those procedures. But the language in that bill, the SAFE Act, it lists very specific procedures and their commonly accepted outcomes. Is it fair to call that an experiment if we know the outcome?
I think it is, simply because the outcome is not the same every time. And so it hasn't been done enough that it's consistent. And just like with these women, the information that they were given as preteens, as teenagers, were that the hormones were reversible, but then they weren't. And then when they went into the surgeries, that was exactly how they were feeling, but they really still had that child's mind. And so they weren't able to make that decision. Once they became an adult, they felt very differently. And so when it comes to children, we do feel that this is just experimental.
How many people in Missouri would this bill impact?
I am not sure.
We'll get to that in a minute, because I think on the sports side, there were some people who testified and said there were only maybe 5 examples in the whole state.
On the sports side, they did say there were 5 in the state.
You can't really just walk into a drugstore, though, and buy puberty blockers over the counter. So what's your understanding of how this treatment plan begins at a doctor's office?
So the way that it begins is a parent were to take their child and say they're having gender dysphoria. They start therapy, and then a lot of times they will, if they are in the stages of beginning puberty or close to that, they will start the puberty blocker. And once the parent has made that full decision to
go through with it,
go over to the other sex, then that's when they would stop the puberty blocker and start the hormone therapy.
So I think there's a question there of, if a doctor prescribes a plan of care and a parent consents to it, why would the state step in and ban it?
Because of it being experimental on children, and it's more when it comes to that child, the child is really driving the care, saying this is how I feel. But we've seen examples of grown-ups now saying that when they were children, that is how they felt, but their brain was not fully developed. They didn't have the full understanding, and once they became an adult, they realize that's not how I felt.
There is a concept of a lot of this discussion still being newer. When you zoom out and look 10 years ago, we weren't having the volume of conversations around this topic that we are today. So I think it's fair to say that a lot of these conversations are newer. I want to read to you from the Columbia University Department of Psychiatry, who said gender affirming care saves lives. I don't know if you would agree with that statement, but I'm going to go on to another similar study published in the National Institute for Health that said 82% of transgender individuals have considered killing themselves and 40% have attempted suicide, with suicidality highest among transgender youth. How would you address that problem?
I think that therapy definitely has to be the main discussion, but what they don't tell you is how many people who have started that process and found out that it's not reversible, that are
Well, neither is suicide.
that are now suicidal, so that did get to start the process or that did get to transition and now are suicidal because that is not what they wanted. So I think that it's just very leaning on those reports because those are, who are doing them. And
these
it
are
is
tough
very
topics.
new. It's a tough topic and it is very new, but the main point of the discussion is if this is what you want to do, we feel that it is better to do it as an adult, to wait the few years and not have children be the ones undergoing this.
There was another study that looked at the underlying cause of some of the depression or suicidality that often accompanies this, and it looked for a root cause and published this, quote, plausible explanation in the Journal of Psychiatric Practice. It found that transgender teens consider suicide when they don't feel they belong or when they feel like they are some sort of a heavy burden on family or society or those close to them. You're billed to ban sports. How does that impact a teen's feeling that they belong?
So there are many reasons why a kid doesn't make the team. There are many things that disqualify you. And with our bill banning or requiring you to play in the sport of your biological birth is simply saying that if you are a born male, you are not qualified to play in a female sport. You are bigger, stronger, and faster. And the strides that women have made, the accomplishments that women have made in the last 50 years since Title IX, I mean, we certainly should not have to start giving that up because of feelings. When there's feelings being affected when a kid doesn't make the team because they're not fast enough, or when a kid doesn't make the team because they don't have anyone to take them home after practice and they live way out in the country, but they're too poor to afford a ride. I mean, there are many things that keep kids from being able to make a team. And so this is just one of those things that makes you not eligible for the team or qualified for the team.
There are some sports that don't have cuts. Trust me, as an athlete who was cut from teams playing for basketball and competitive sports, there are others where everyone can go and apply and compete. So it's not always the case that an athlete is cut for some reason.
Or that can't participate for some reason?
Right, you're suggesting a coach says this person doesn't meet the criteria to compete for the only 12 spots or 12 jerseys we have on this bench. There are sports like wrestling or like cross country where that wouldn't apply, would it?
Well, it wouldn't, but I grew up with kids who lived in the same trailer park as me out in the country that even though they were great at basketball, they couldn't be on the team because they didn't have anyone that would bring them home after practice for them to stay after school and practice.
I hardly see the relevance.
Because of their ride, they couldn't make the team.
Okay.
So I mean, that was hurt feelings as well. That because they were poor, they weren't eligible to play on the team because they couldn't meet the criteria, which was making all the practices and getting home.
Wouldn't the solution be to help get them a ride?
It
Not
would
to tell
be,
them to stay home?
It would be, but that's not what the solution is. I mean,
I want to talk about the choice the legislature made here because there's always a number of choices. It's not always just yes or no. The
that's
legislature
absolutely true.
is sometimes described as a blunt instrument. I don't know if you would agree with that, but
It is, and that's because of the nature of laws and policy.
And I think there's probably some red state, blue state competition happening at the same time across, but that's the national scale. But let's zero in on the choices that were on the table, because I think there were others that were rushed past and ignored.
Okay.
You saw that recent op-ed from a whistleblower at the WashU Transgender Center at the St. Louis Children's Hospital.
I did.
That struck a chord in Missouri, of course. She wrote about what she perceived as a lack of consistent safety standards in the transgender center. Of course, she wrote how every teen, and you've alluded to already, how every teen has to go through these counseling standards. They have to go through these decisions. It's not a knee-jerk decision happening
That's
right at
very
once.
True.
After that phase was over, this whistleblower, who was a case manager, not a doctor, but a case manager, she argued in favor of more ethical standards, more safety protocols. Any bill filed in the legislature could have required that, could have raised the bar, could have set the standard, could have said, okay, if we're uncomfortable or we're unsure or we're not quite sure what this is, let's raise the bar to here. But instead, you banned it altogether. Why give up on the option to do something safely or to require more safety?
So these bills were filed way before the whistleblower came out.
But they weren't passed before that.
These were actually filed last year, and we didn't get them across the line. So these are policies that we have agreed on as a caucus, as a Republican caucus. We have agreed on these policies and wanted to pass these way before the whistleblower. And it's because of us feeling that children whose mind is not complete yet, being the driver of these very, life-changing, life-altering decisions, when we think they should be done as adults.
You mentioned, I imagine that you bring witnesses before committees to hear their stories. So I would hope your minds aren't made up before people testify.
Right.
The same might be true for many of the advocates in the transgender community who would tell their stories about teens who, you've given some examples today about people who went through it and had regret or remorse later in life. There are other examples on the flip side of that coin. People who were living in depression, people who went through with the transition, and their parents and their teachers and coaches said after the transition they blossomed, their grades improved, they became more active, they became more open and engaged and happier, healthier members of society. How did those stories impact your thinking at all?
We still felt that with the number of folks that did come forward and the number of stories across the U.S., that it was important enough to ban until adulthood.
So once someone turns 18, and for clarity, those people watching, there are some timelines here. So people who are already undergoing treatment, perhaps they or their families, I imagine they're aware of this, but if they're already in that treatment pipeline, this would not apply to them. There's sort of a moratorium.
Right, that's right. They're grandfathered in.
We are coming up on an interview soon with State Senator Bill Eigel. We know he's declared to run for governor. What are your plans in 2024?
I'm not 100% sure just yet. I have the ability to rerun for Senate. I could do 4 more years in the Senate, or possibly a statewide office. So right now I'm weighing my options. I do enjoy being a senator, and I feel that we've gotten some really good things done.
How do you make a decision like that? Is it just to spin the wheel and see what statewide office you land on, or?
You know, it is not. It is not. The lieutenant governor's position is the one that has been interesting to me, but there are also other positions that could be available. You know, our Secretary of State has said that he may be running for governor, and so that position might be open as well, but it's more just waiting until probably the summertime when we see what spots are open, and then I'll make the decision at that time.
One last question. I don't know if anyone in our audience will find it interesting, but it stuck out to me and it scratched my curiosity there. In this bill, it said the provisions of this section, this is about the medical bill, not the sports bill.
Okay.
The provisions of this section shall not apply to any speech protected by the First Amendment of the United States Constitution. What did that mean? What was that anticipating?
That we're not going to impede on free speech. Possibly, you know, doctor referrals was one thing that had gotten brought up, that we don't want to make any type of
It's sidestepping a lawsuit from a doctor who says you're violating my First Amendment right of association, basically.
On allowing them to, you know, refer a patient to therapy or to another doctor in the case of gender dysphoria.
That makes sense. Senator Holly Thompson-Rader, we hope to see you along the campaign trail perhaps, or beyond.
Thank you for having me on.
Thanks for joining us.